My aunt switched my DNA results and made it look like I wasn't my grandfather's biological heir, so she could steal my inheritance. She was shocked when I flipped the script. My Aunt Candace switched my DNA results to steal my grandfather's inheritance in February by intercepting the test we'd all taken to settle his estate. Grandfather had died in December, leaving behind a complicated will that required DNA confirmation for all potential heirs because he'd had children from multiple marriages. The estate was worth $3 million and would go entirely to his closest biological descendant. Everyone assumed that would be me since I was his only grandchild from his eldest son, but Candace had other plans. She worked at the medical center where we'd submitted our samples and used her access to tamper with the results before they were processed. The results came back showing I had no biological relationship to my grandfather, while Candace's son Randy, my cousin, was supposedly his only biological heir. I was devastated because my grandfather had raised me after my parents died when I was 10, and I knew without doubt he was my biological grandfather. Candace pretended to be shocked and comforted me while saying genetics could be surprising sometimes, and maybe my father wasn't who we thought. She suggested my grandmother might have had an affair, and my dad wasn't really my grandfather's son. She said it was unfortunate, but DNA didn't lie, and we had to accept the truth. Randy immediately started talking about what he'd do with the money, like buying sports cars and traveling the world. At the will reading, Candace presented the DNA results to the lawyer and claimed the entire inheritance for Randy. She said it was only fair that the estate go to the actual blood family, and not someone who'd been deceiving everyone for years. She actually accused me of knowing I wasn't related and trying to steal from the real family. The lawyer seemed suspicious because the grandfather had specifically mentioned me in personal notes, but said the will was clear about biological descendants only. Candace smiled and said grandfather would be relieved to know his money was going to his real family. Something felt wrong, so I ordered my own private DNA test from a different company. When those results came back, they showed I was definitely my grandfather's biological grandchild, with a 99.9% match to his sister who was still alive. I confronted Candace with the conflicting results, and she said private companies made mistakes all the time, and only the official medical center results counted for legal purposes. She said I was desperate and pathetic trying to contest legitimate scientific results because I wanted money that wasn't mine. That's when I started investigating and discovered Candace had access to the lab where our tests were processed. I contacted other people who'd had DNA tests at that medical center and found 3 families who'd gotten suspicious. Results that later proved false when retested elsewhere. All of them had their tests processed during Candace's shifts. One family had been told their daughter wasn't biologically theirs and almost divorced before discovering the results were wrong. Another man was told he wasn't the father of his son and had cut off child support before a court-ordered retest proved he was. I reached out to Candace's ex-husband, who told me she'd always been obsessed with grandfather's money and had tried multiple schemes to get it over the years. She'd forged his signature on loan documents, stolen his credit cards, and even tried to have him declared mentally incompetent before he banned her from his house. He said Candace had been planning something involving the inheritance for months and had specifically gotten the job at the medical center after grandfather announced the DNA requirement. I pretended to accept the results while secretly working with a private investigator who specialized in medical fraud. He found that Candace had logged into the system at unusual hours and accessed specifically our family's test results multiple times. He also discovered she'd ordered Randy's DNA test weeks before grandfather died, suggesting she'd been planning this before the will was even read. We got a court order for all of us to retake the tests at a different facility with strict chain of custody protocols. Candace tried to refuse, saying it was harassment to question verified medical results, but the judge noted the irregularities in her access patterns. The test was scheduled for a Monday morning with a representative from the court present to observe. Candace called in sick that day claiming food poisoning, but the judge said the test would proceed with or without her. The new results confirmed what I already knew, that I was my grandfather's biological grandchild, and Randy had no biological relationship to him at all. It turned out Randy wasn't even Candace's biological son, but was her stepson from her second marriage. She'd submitted his DNA knowing he couldn't be related, and then switched my negative results with his to make it look like he was the heir. She'd literally tried to steal $3 million by committing medical fraud and identity theft. The prosecutor charged Candace with 17 counts of medical fraud affecting multiple families, but at her arraignment she looked oddly calm. I sat in the courtroom watching Candace's calm expression at her arraignment and felt my stomach drop because that look meant she thought she had a way out. She wore a navy blue suit like she was attending a business meeting instead of facing criminal charges, and her hands rested folded on the table in front of her without any sign of nervousness. Roberta Parrish, the prosecutor, noticed too because I saw her eyes narrow as she studied Candace's face. Roberta stood up when the judge asked about bail and requested $200,000 given the flight risk and the serious nature of the charges. She explained that Candace had demonstrated a pattern of deception and manipulation, had access to financial resources through the attempted theft, and had already shown willingness to destroy evidence by tampering with medical records. Candace's expensive lawyer, a man in a gray suit who looked like he charged $500 an hour, argued she was a respected medical professional with deep community ties. He said she had lived in the area her entire life, had an elderly mother who depended on her, and had never missed a day of work in 15 years. He claimed the charges were based on circumstantial evidence, and his client deserved reasonable bail that wouldn't punish her before trial. The judge looked at the paperwork in front of him for what felt like forever, before setting bail at $200,000. I felt a tiny bit of relief until Candace's parents, who were sitting 3 rows behind her, immediately stood up and followed the bailiff out to post the bond. Within 2 hours, Candace walked out of the courthouse as a free woman, and I realized this was going to be a much longer fight than I expected. Guillermo called me to his office the next day, and I could tell from his voice on the phone that something was wrong. I drove over immediately and found him sitting at his desk with papers spread everywhere and his computer screen showing bank statements. He explained that Candace being out on bail meant we needed to move fast to protect the estate assets because she might try to hide money or create more problems. He had hired a forensic accountant to look into Candace's finances as part of our civil case against her, and what they discovered made my blood run cold. The accountant found that Candace had been quietly transferring money to offshore accounts for the past 3 weeks, clearly preparing for this outcome. She had moved almost $400,000 to banks in the Cayman Islands and Panama using shell companies her parents had set up. The transfers started right after the court ordered the new DNA tests, which meant she knew she was caught and was already planning her escape. Guillermo showed me the transaction records and explained that this was exactly the kind of behavior that showed consciousness of guilt. He immediately started drafting emergency motions to freeze all of Candace's assets and restrict her travel, arguing she was actively preparing to flee jurisdiction with stolen inheritance money. He worked through lunch getting everything filed with the court, and I sat in his office feeling sick because Candace had been 10 steps ahead of us this whole time. The hearing on the asset freeze happened within 48 hours because Guillermo convinced Judge Hong it was an emergency situation. We sat in a smaller courtroom than before, just us and Candace's lawyer and the judge. Candace's lawyer argued the transfers were legitimate financial planning and his client had every right to manage her own money. He said she was simply diversifying her investments and the timing was coincidental. He tried to make it sound like we were harassing an innocent woman who was protecting her assets from a frivolous lawsuit. The forensic accountant testified next and completely destroyed that argument by showing the suspicious timing and destinations of the money. He explained that the shell companies were created just days before the transfers, that the amounts matched almost exactly what Candace thought she would get from the inheritance, and that the banks she chose were known for making it difficult to recover funds. He walked through each transaction showing how Candace had deliberately structured everything to hide the money trail. Judge Hong listened to everything without showing much expression, then ordered all of Candace's accounts frozen immediately, and demanded she surrender her passport within 24 hours. I watched Candace's calm mask crack just slightly when the ruling came down, and I saw her jaw tighten, and her hands grip the edge of the table. Sebastian called me 3 days later saying he had discovered something important and needed to meet right away. We met at a coffee shop near my apartment, and he pulled out his laptop showing me phone records and recorded conversations. He explained that Candace had been contacting Randy's biological mother, trying to get her to provide false testimony about Randy's relationship to my grandfather. Randy's biological mother was a woman named Teresa who had given him up for adoption when he was 2 years old and hadn't been part of his life since. Sebastian found that Candace had tracked Teresa down and called her multiple times over the past month. Teresa had recorded the conversations where Candace offered her $50,000 to lie under oath and say that my grandfather had acknowledged Randy as his grandson. Candace wanted Teresa to claim that my grandfather had privately told her Randy was his favorite and should inherit everything. Teresa brought the recordings to Roberta because she was disgusted by the whole scheme and wanted nothing to do with it. Sebastian played me parts of the recordings, and I heard Candace's voice explaining exactly what Teresa should say, and promising her the money once the inheritance came through. This added witness tampering to Candace's charges, and showed the prosecutors she was actively trying to obstruct justice even after being caught. Roberta filed additional charges that same day, and I felt a grim satisfaction knowing Candace's desperation was making everything worse for herself. I met with the other victims of Candace's fraud at Roberta's request, so we could coordinate our impact statements for the eventual sentencing. We gathered in a conference room at the prosecutor's office, and I looked around at 5 other people whose lives Candace had destroyed for money. There was a couple in their 40s who almost divorced after. Candace's fake DNA test said their daughter wasn't biologically theirs. A man in his 30s who lost 2 years of his son's life after cutting off contact based on falsified paternity results. An elderly woman who was told her grandson wasn't related to her deceased son and spent her final years believing her family line had ended. Hearing their stories made me realize how many lives Candace had destroyed for money and how little she cared about the families she was tearing apart. One woman named Alexandria Gorman broke down crying when she described how she lost custody of her daughter for 2 years based on Candace's falsified paternity test. Her ex-husband had used the fake results to prove Alexandria had cheated on him, and the judge awarded him full custody, while Alexandria fought to prove the truth. By the time the real DNA test confirmed she was the biological mother, her daughter barely remembered her and the relationship was permanently damaged. Alexandria's hands shook as she talked, and I felt my anger solidify into determination that Candace would face real consequences for every single life she had ruined. 3 weeks after the arraignment, Candace's lawyer approached Guillermo about a plea deal, where she would plead guilty to 5 counts in exchange for dropping the other 12. Guillermo called me to his office to discuss it, and explained that Roberta was willing to consider the offer because trials were expensive and unpredictable. He said that even with Strong evidence. Juries could be swayed by good defense lawyers, and a plea deal guaranteed some consequences where trials could end in acquittals. I struggled with the decision because part of me wanted to see Candace face every single charge in court and have a jury tell her she was guilty 17 times. I wanted her to sit through weeks of testimony hearing how she destroyed families and ruined lives. But Guillermo explained that 5 counts would still mean significant prison time, and we would avoid the risk of her walking free if something went wrong at trial. He said Roberta was pushing for at least 3 to 5 years in prison as part of any deal, plus full restitution to all victims. I told him I needed time to think about it, and to talk to the other victims before making any decisions. That night I barely slept, thinking about whether accepting less than everything was giving up or being smart. During a strategy meeting 2 days later, Sebastian came in looking excited, and said he had found evidence that this wasn't Candace's first attempt at inheritance fraud. He explained that she had tried something similar with a distant cousin's estate 5 years ago, but that family had settled privately to avoid publicity. The cousin, Hugo Smith, was willing to testify about Candace's pattern of targeting family members for financial gain. Sebastian showed us the court documents from the previous case where Candace had claimed she was entitled to half of her cousin's inheritance based on a verbal promise from the deceased. The family had eventually paid her $50,000 to go away rather than fight it in court. Hugo said he always suspected Candace had forged documents to support her claim, but they couldn't prove it, and the settlement was cheaper than litigation. This new evidence strengthened the prosecution's case significantly, because it showed Candace had a pattern of inheritance fraud going back years. Roberta called me that afternoon and said she was rejecting the plea offer and preparing for trial because the pattern evidence made conviction much more likely. She explained that judges and juries took pattern evidence very seriously, and it would be almost impossible for Candace to claim this was a one-time mistake. I had to sit for a deposition 2 weeks later, where Candace's lawyer tried to make me look like a gold digger who invented the fraud allegations to steal the inheritance myself. We met in a conference room at his office with a court reporter recording everything, and Guillermo sitting next to me. The lawyer started by asking about my relationship with my grandfather, and implying that I had manipulated him into favoring me over other family members. He questioned why I didn't report my suspicions immediately after getting the first DNA results, and suggested I had plenty of time to manipulate the private DNA test results. He asked if I had financial problems that would motivate me to contest the original results. He implied my grandfather had favored me unfairly because my parents were dead, and I had gotten more attention than Candace and Randy. Guillermo objected repeatedly when the questions got too personal or accusatory, and I forced myself to stay calm even though I wanted to scream. I remembered Guillermo telling me this was just legal strategy and the evidence spoke for itself. I answered every question honestly and simply, explaining that I knew the first results were wrong because I looked exactly like my father and grandfather. I described how I discovered Candace's access to the lab and found the other victims. By the end of 3 hours, the lawyer looked frustrated, and I felt like I had held my ground. The medical center completed its internal investigation 4 weeks after the criminal charges were filed and fired Candace for gross misconduct. They also reported her to the state medical board for license revocation proceedings. I found out through Guillermo, who got a call from the medical center's lawyer explaining they were taking full responsibility for their security failures. Watching Candace lose her career gave me some satisfaction, because it meant she was facing consequences beyond just the criminal case. But I also realized she was now desperate with nothing left to lose. She had no job, no income, frozen bank accounts, and was facing years in prison. Sebastian called me that evening and warned me to be careful, because desperate people made dangerous choices. He suggested installing security cameras at my apartment and varying my daily routine so I wasn't predictable. I agreed, even though part of me thought it was paranoid. The next day, a security company came and installed cameras at my front door and in the parking lot. I started parking in different spots and taking different routes to work. Every time I heard footsteps behind me or saw a car that looked familiar, my heart raced. 2 months after the arraignment, everything came to a head when Candace violated her bail conditions by trying to access one of her frozen accounts through a shell company her parents had set up. The bank flagged the suspicious activity because the account was supposed to be completely frozen by court order. They reported it immediately to Judge Hong's office and to Roberta. I got a call from Guillermo telling me to get to the courthouse right away because there was an emergency hearing. I drove over as fast as I could and found Roberta and Guillermo already in the courtroom with Candace and her lawyer. Judge Hong came in looking angry and asked Candace's lawyer to explain why his client had attempted to access frozen assets in direct violation of court orders. The lawyer tried to claim it was a misunderstanding, and that Candace's parents had made the attempt without her knowledge. Judge Hong cut him off and said the shell company was registered in Candace's name, and the access attempt came from her computer. He said Candace had shown complete disregard for court authority and was clearly planning to flee with whatever money she could access. He revoked her bail immediately and ordered her taken into custody. I watched Candace get handcuffed right there in the courtroom, and for the first time she looked genuinely scared. Her calm mask was completely gone, and I saw panic in her eyes as the bailiff led her away. Watching her disappear through the door into the holding cells, I finally let myself believe justice might actually happen. With Candace locked up, her lawyer started calling Guillermo every other day trying to work out a deal. Roberta told me they were getting desperate because Candace was stuck in county jail with no bail and facing months there if we went to trial. The lawyer kept pushing for a better offer, saying Candace would plead guilty to fewer charges if we dropped some counts. Guillermo set up a meeting at his office to discuss the new proposal, and I drove over feeling confused about what I actually wanted. Part of me wanted Candace to face every single charge in court and get the maximum sentence possible. Another part of me just wanted this whole nightmare to be over, so I could move on with my life. Roberta laid out the revised plea deal on Guillermo's conference table and explained what Candace's lawyer was offering. Candace would plead guilty to 10 counts of medical fraud instead of all 17. She'd accept a prison sentence between 5 and 7 years with no chance of getting out early. She'd have to pay back every victim for what she'd done, including giving me the full $3 million inheritance. She'd also lose her medical license forever and couldn't work in healthcare again. Roberta said this was actually a strong deal because it guaranteed real prison time and money back for everyone Candace hurt. Guillermo agreed and told me that trials were unpredictable, and sometimes guilty people walked free because of technicalities or jury decisions. This deal meant Candace would definitely go to prison, and definitely pay us back, even if it wasn't the absolute worst punishment she could get. I asked what would happen if we said no, and went to trial instead. Roberta explained that trials took months to prepare and could last weeks in court. I'd have to testify about everything Candace did, and get questioned by her lawyer who would try to make me look bad. The other victims would have to testify too and relive their trauma in front of strangers. There was also a chance, however small, that Candace could get acquitted on some charges if her lawyer found ways to create doubt. Guillermo added that even if we won at trial, sentencing could be lighter than 5 years depending on what arguments the defense made. I felt sick thinking about Candace possibly getting less time or getting off on some charges. But I also hated the idea of her avoiding 7 of the counts she was charged with. Roberta said I should talk to Alexandria and Hugo before making a final decision, since we were the 3 victims with the biggest damages from Candace's fraud. She gave me their contact information, and I called them both that evening to set up a meeting. Alexandria suggested we meet at a coffee shop near the courthouse since it was neutral ground for all of us. I got there first and ordered tea I didn't really want, just to have something to do with my hands. Hugo arrived next, a tall guy in his 50s who looked tired in a way that went deeper than just lack of sleep. Alexandria came in last, a woman around my mom's age who moved carefully like she was protecting herself from invisible blows. We sat at a corner table away from other customers, and I explained the plea deal Roberta had offered. Alexandria's hands shook slightly as she held her coffee cup, and she asked how long Candace would actually be in prison. I told her 5 to 7 years with no early release, and Alexandria nodded slowly. Hugo leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, his jaw tight. He wanted to know why we were letting Candace off easy by dropping 7 charges. I tried to explain what Roberta and Guillermo had said about trials being risky, and this deal guaranteeing consequences. Hugo interrupted and said Candace deserved to face all 17 counts in court and get the maximum possible sentence. She'd destroyed families and ruined lives for money, and 7 charges was 7 crimes she wouldn't have to answer for. Alexandria spoke up quietly and said she couldn't handle a trial. She'd already been through so much therapy trying to recover from losing her daughter, and the thought of sitting in court describing that pain to strangers made her want to throw up. She said 5 years in prison was real punishment, and getting her money back for legal fees and therapy would help her move forward. Hugo argued that justice wasn't about what was easiest for us, it was about making sure Candace paid for everything she did. We went back and forth for almost 2 hours, with Hugo getting more angry and Alexandria getting more upset. I found myself somewhere in the middle, understanding both of their positions, but not knowing which one was right. Finally, Alexandria started crying and said she just wanted this to be over. She'd lost years of her daughter's childhood because of Candace's lies, and dragging this out through a long trial would cost her even more time she'd never get back. Hugo's expression softened when he saw Alexandria crying, and he reached across the table to squeeze her hand. He said he was sorry for pushing so hard, he just hated seeing Candace get away with anything. I pointed out that 5 to 7 years in prison plus losing her career and paying back millions wasn't exactly getting away with it. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was real accountability that we could be certain would happen. Hugo was quiet for a long time, staring at his empty coffee cup. Then he said that maybe I was right, and maybe knowing for sure that Candace would face consequences was better than risking a trial that might go wrong. Alexandria wiped her eyes and asked if we were all agreeing to accept the plea deal. I said I thought we should, but only if we added one condition. I told them about something called allocution that I'd read about online while researching plea deals. It meant Candace would have to stand up in court and describe exactly what she did to each of us in detail. She'd have to admit intercepting my DNA test and switching the results. She'd have to admit falsifying Alexandria's paternity test and making her think her daughter wasn't hers. She'd have to admit whatever she did to Hugo and explain why she did it. Alexandria sat up straighter and said she liked that idea, because it meant Candace couldn't just plead guilty and stay silent. Hugo nodded and said making Candace confess publicly was important, because it would be on the court record forever. I called Guillermo right there from the coffee shop and told him we'd accept the plea deal only if Candace had to allocate. Guillermo said he'd call Roberta immediately and make that a requirement of the deal. He warned me that Candace's lawyer might refuse because defendants usually hated allocution, but he'd do his best to make it happen. Over the next few days, Guillermo kept me updated on the negotiations. Roberta told Candace's lawyer that allocution wasn't optional, and if Candace wouldn't do it, the deal was off the table completely. The lawyer tried to argue that a simple guilty plea should be enough, but Roberta held firm. She said the victims deserved to hear Candace admit what she did, and without that, we'd go to trial on all 17 counts. Finally, 3 days later, Guillermo called to say Candace had agreed to allocate. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out, which gave everyone time to prepare. Roberta would send us the format for victim impact statements that we could read after Candace's allocution. Guillermo explained that I should write down how Candace's fraud affected my life and what I wanted the judge to know when deciding on the final sentence. I spent those 3 weeks trying to write my statement and failing repeatedly. Every time I started, I'd get angry or sad and have to stop. How could I explain in a few paragraphs what it felt like to have my aunt try to erase my connection to my grandfather? How could I describe the feeling of being told I didn't belong to my own family? Sebastian checked in on me a few times during those weeks, asking how I was holding up. I admitted I was struggling with the statement, and he told me not to overthink it. He said the most powerful impact statements were the ones that came from the heart and focused on specific moments rather than general feelings. I took his advice and started over, this time writing about the day I got the fake DNA results and how my whole world shifted. I wrote about sitting at the will reading and hearing Candace accuse me of being a fraud. I wrote about the months of investigation and the constant fear that I'd never prove the truth. By the time the allocution hearing arrived, I had 3 pages that felt honest, even if they weren't perfect. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with old wooden benches and fluorescent lights that made everything look washed out. I sat in the front row with Alexandria on one side and Hugo on the other, all of us silent and tense. Candace was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than I remembered. She didn't look at any of us as the bailiff removed her handcuffs and she sat next to her lawyer. Judge Hong came in and everyone stood, then sat back down when she took her seat at the bench. The judge asked if Candace was ready to allocate as part of her plea agreement, and Candace's lawyer said yes. Candace stood up and her lawyer handed her a piece of paper, probably notes about what she needed to say. Judge Hong told her to describe her actions regarding each victim, starting with me. Candace's voice was flat and emotionless as she started talking. She said she'd worked at the medical center and had access to the lab where DNA tests were processed. When our family submitted samples for my grandfather's estate, she logged into the system and pulled up the results before they were finalized. She intercepted my test showing I was my grandfather's biological heir and switched it with Randy's test showing he had no biological connection. She then falsified the documentation to make it look like Randy was the heir and I wasn't related at all. She did this because she wanted the $3 million inheritance to go to Randy, who she was raising as her son, instead of to me. Her voice never changed tone as she described the technical steps she took, like she was explaining a science experiment instead of confessing to destroying my life. She never looked at me once during the whole thing. When she finished talking about my case, Judge Hong told her to continue with the next victim. Candace described falsifying Alexandria's paternity test by switching the mother's DNA sample with a random sample from the lab's database. She explained that Alexandria had paid for a test to confirm her daughter's biological relationship, and Candace had made it show no maternal match. She said she did this because Alexandria's ex-husband had paid her $5,000 to help him get custody by proving Alexandria wasn't the biological mother. Alexandria made a small sound next to me, like she'd been punched, and I reached over to hold her hand. Candace moved on to Hugo's case without pausing. She admitted falsifying a DNA test 5 years ago that made it look like Hugo's cousin wasn't related to their grandmother, allowing Candace's family member to claim a larger share of that estate. She said she'd been practicing this type of fraud for years before doing it to our family. Judge Hong asked if there were any other victims she needed to address, and Candace listed off the other families whose tests she'd tampered with. For each one, she gave the same flat, technical description of what she'd done and why. The whole allocution took almost 40 minutes, and by the end I felt numb. This was supposed to be closure, hearing Candace admit everything, but instead it felt like listening to a robot read a crime report. There was no emotion, no apology, no acknowledgement that she'd hurt real people. She just stood there describing her crimes like they were items on a grocery list. After Candace sat down, Judge Hong asked if the victims wanted to read their impact statements before she accepted the plea. Roberta stood up and said yes. 3 victims had prepared statements. Alexandria went first, walking up to the podium with shaking hands and unfolding her papers. She read in a quiet voice about the day she got the test results saying her daughter wasn't biologically hers. She described how her ex-husband used those results to take full custody and how she'd spent 2 years fighting to get her child back. She talked about the therapy sessions where she cried so hard she couldn't breathe, and the nights she lay awake wondering if her daughter would ever forgive her for giving up. She explained that even after the truth came out and she got custody back, her relationship with her daughter was damaged in ways that might never fully heal. Her daughter had spent formative years believing her mother abandoned her, and that belief left scars. Alexandria's voice broke as she finished, saying that Candace hadn't just stolen time from her, she'd stolen her daughter's childhood and her own chance to be the mother she'd always wanted to be. When Alexandria sat down, Hugo walked up to read his statement. His voice was steadier than Alexandria's but filled with anger. He talked about his grandmother's estate and how Candace's fraud had torn his family apart. Cousins who'd been close for decades stopped speaking to each other over the inheritance dispute. His sister had a breakdown from the stress and ended up hospitalized. Family gatherings that used to be joyful became battlegrounds where everyone accused everyone else of lying. Even after the fraud was exposed, the relationships never recovered. Some family members still believed the false results and thought Hugo had somehow manipulated the retests. Hugo said Candace hadn't just committed fraud. She'd destroyed a family's trust in each other, and that damage was permanent. He sat down heavily, like the weight of his words had exhausted him. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium feeling like I might throw up, but I forced myself to unfold my statement and start reading. I told Judge Hong about my grandfather raising me after my parents died, and how he was the only real parent I'd ever known. I described the will reading where Candace accused me of being a fraud and trying to steal from the real family. I talked about the months where I questioned my own identity and wondered if maybe the fake results were true. I explained that Candace hadn't just tried to steal money from me. She'd tried to erase my connection to the man who raised me. She'd tried to make me believe I didn't belong to my own family and that my grandfather's love for me was based on a lie. Even now, after proving the truth, I sometimes had moments of doubt where I wondered if I really belonged anywhere. That was what Candace had done to me, planted a seed of doubt about my own identity that would probably never fully go away. My voice was shaking by the time I finished, but I made it through the whole statement without crying. I folded the papers and walked back to my seat, feeling Alexandria squeeze my shoulder as I sat down. Judge Hong thanked us for our statements and said she'd reviewed all the evidence and the plea agreement. She asked Candace if she understood that by pleading guilty to 10 counts of medical fraud, she was giving up her right to a trial and accepting whatever sentence the court imposed within the agreed range. Candace said yes in that same flat voice. Judge Hong accepted the plea and said she'd now determine the sentence. She talked about the seriousness of Candace's crimes and how she'd abused her position of trust in the medical field. She mentioned the number of victims and the lasting harm Candace had caused. Then she said she was sentencing Candace to 6 years in state prison with no possibility of parole, followed by 10 years of probation. During probation, Candace couldn't work in healthcare or any job that involved handling confidential information. She also had to pay full restitution to every victim, starting with the $3 million she tried to steal from me. Judge Hong listed out the amounts for Alexandria's legal fees and therapy costs, Hugo's settlement from the previous fraud, and payments to the other victims. The total came to almost $4 million, which meant Candace would be paying restitution for the rest of her life. Judge Hong asked if Candace understood the sentence, and Candace said yes. The bailiff came over to put the handcuffs back on, and I watched them lead Candace toward the door that went to the holding cells. For just a second, Candace looked back at me, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been fear or regret. Then she was gone through the door and it closed behind her. I sat there feeling exhausted in a way that went beyond just being tired. This whole process had taken something from me that I'd never get back. Some kind of innocence or trust in family. Alexandria was crying quietly next to me, and Hugo had his head in his hands. Roberta came over and told us we'd done well, and that justice had been served. But sitting in that courtroom after Candace was led away, I didn't feel triumphant or relieved. I just felt empty. The paperwork to transfer my grandfather's estate took another 6 weeks because of all the legal complications from the fraud. Guillermo had to file motions proving I was the rightful heir, get court approval to unfreeze the accounts, and work with the estate lawyer to finalize everything. He called me every few days with updates about forms that needed signing or judges who needed to approve things. I went through the motions of responding to emails and showing up at his office when needed, but I felt disconnected from it all. The money didn't feel real or important anymore. Finally, on a Tuesday morning in late spring, Guillermo called to say the transfer was complete. The $3 million was now legally mine and sitting in an account with my name on it. He suggested I come to his office to review the final documents and discuss next steps. I drove over and sat across from his desk while he showed me bank statements and investment options. The numbers on the page seemed impossible, like they belonged to someone else's life. Guillermo asked if I was okay, and I realized I'd been staring at the statements without really seeing them. I told him I was fine, just processing everything. He said that was normal, and I should take my time figuring out what to do with the inheritance. There was no rush to make decisions. I thanked him and took the documents home, where I sat on my couch staring at them for hours. This was what Candace had tried to steal, what she'd committed fraud and destroyed families for. $3 million that was supposed to make me feel secure or happy or something. Instead, I just felt empty, because all I really wanted was my grandfather back and the family I thought I had. The money couldn't give me that. A week later, I met with Guillermo and Sebastian to settle their fees for everything they'd done. Guillermo had his invoice ready, detailing all the hours he'd spent on the case, but then he crossed out half the charges. He said he couldn't in good conscience charge me full price when he knew how much this case had taken from me emotionally. Sebastian did the same thing with his investigation fees, reducing them significantly. I looked at both of them and said absolutely not. They'd given me justice when I felt completely powerless, and I was going to pay them what their work was actually worth. Guillermo tried to argue, but I cut him off. I told him this was the one thing I could control in this whole mess, making sure the people who helped me got compensated fairly. He finally agreed, and I wrote checks for the full amounts they'd originally invoiced. Sebastian looked at his check and then at me, his expression serious. He said he wanted to use my case as an example in his training materials for other fraud investigators. He'd changed the names and identifying details, but the pattern of how Candace committed the fraud and how we uncovered it could help other families going through similar situations. He asked if I'd be okay with that. I thought about it for a minute and then said yes. If my nightmare could help other victims, then maybe the whole experience had some meaning beyond just my own pain. Sebastian thanked me and promised to send me the materials before he used them, to make sure I was comfortable with how the case was presented. After they left, I sat in Guillermo's office for a few more minutes, feeling something shift inside me. The money wasn't just about me anymore. It was about taking what Candace tried to steal and using it to help people she'd hurt and people who might get hurt in the future. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I got a call from a lawyer I didn't recognize. He said he was representing Randy and that Randy wanted to talk to me privately. I immediately felt suspicious because Randy had been part of Candace's scheme, even if he claimed not to know about it. The lawyer said Randy understood if I didn't want to meet, but he was hoping I'd give him a chance to explain. I told the lawyer I'd only meet in Guillermo's office with Guillermo present, and the lawyer agreed. We set it up for the following Tuesday. When Randy walked into Guillermo's office, he looked terrible. He'd lost weight and had dark circles under his eyes like he wasn't sleeping. He sat down across from me and Guillermo, his hands shaking slightly. I asked him what he wanted to say. Randy started crying almost immediately, apologizing over and over. He said Candace had told him that my grandfather specifically wanted him to have the inheritance because he'd always felt guilty about not being closer to Randy growing up. She'd shown him fake documents and emails that made it look like my grandfather had planned everything. Randy said he never questioned it because Candace was his stepmother and he trusted her completely. He'd believed her when she said the DNA results proved he was the rightful heir. He had no idea she'd falsified anything until the court-ordered retests came back. By then, he'd already spent some of the money she'd given him, and he felt sick realizing it had all been stolen. He looked at me with red eyes and said he knew sorry wasn't enough, but he wanted me to know he hadn't been part of the fraud knowingly. He offered to testify about how Candace had manipulated him if it would help, though Guillermo pointed out the criminal case was already over. Randy said he'd do anything to make this right. He just needed me to know he wasn't trying to steal from me on purpose. I sat there watching him cry and felt my anger at him start to dissolve. He'd lost the only mother figure he had and found out she'd used him as a tool in her fraud scheme. In some ways, he was another one of Candace's victims, just in a different way than the rest of us. After Randy left, I asked Guillermo what he thought. Guillermo said Randy seemed genuine and that being manipulated by Candace didn't make him a bad person. I spent the next few days thinking about Randy and what he'd said. He'd grown up with Candace as his stepmother after his biological mother left, and she'd been the only parental figure he really had. Now he had to process that the person who raised him was a criminal who'd used him in her schemes. That couldn't be easy. I called Guillermo and told him I wanted to give Randy $50,000 from the inheritance. Guillermo asked if I was sure, and I said yes. Randy had lost his stepmother and learned that everything he thought he knew about the inheritance was a lie. That wasn't his fault. Guillermo said he'd draw up paperwork making it clear this was a gift with no legal implications, so Randy couldn't come back later claiming he was owed more. I agreed and signed the documents. When Randy came to pick up the check, he looked shocked. He asked why I was doing this when he didn't deserve anything. I told him he lost the only mother figure he had because of Candace's crimes, and that wasn't fair. He wasn't responsible for what she did. Randy started crying again and said he was going to therapy to process everything Candace had put him through. He said he hoped one day he could become someone who deserved my kindness. I told him I hoped he found peace because carrying anger at him wouldn't heal what his stepmother had destroyed. After Randy left with the check, I felt lighter somehow. The money was supposed to represent justice and security, but giving some of it away to help someone else hurt by Candace felt more meaningful than just keeping it all. Maybe that was how I'd honor my grandfather's memory, by using what he left me to help repair some of the damage Candace had caused. 3 weeks after Randy left with his check, Guillermo called me about a letter from the medical center's lawyers. They wanted to schedule a meeting to discuss their liability in the whole mess with Candace tampering with DNA results. I drove to Guillermo's office the next morning and found him reviewing a thick file of documents about the medical center's security failures. The lawyers were offering $200,000 to settle any potential lawsuit and avoid going to court where their negligence would become public record. Guillermo said it was a decent starting point, but he thought we could push for more given how many families Candace had hurt while working there. I asked what he recommended, and he said he wanted to negotiate for at least $300,000 plus a commitment to fix their security systems, so this could never happen again. The meeting with the medical center's lawyers happened 2 days later in a conference room at their main office. 3 lawyers sat across from us with folders full of paperwork and serious expressions that told me they were worried about how bad this could get for them. Guillermo laid out everything we knew about Candace's access to the lab system and how she'd been able to tamper with results for months without anyone noticing. He pointed out that their lax security had enabled fraud that destroyed families and nearly cost me $3 million I was legally entitled to inherit. The lead lawyer tried to argue that Candace was a trusted employee with years of good service, and they couldn't have predicted she'd commit fraud. Guillermo pulled out the records showing Candace had accessed the system at odd hours and made changes to test results outside her normal duties. He asked why there were no alerts or oversight when an employee was logging in at midnight to modify legal documents. The lawyers looked uncomfortable and asked for a moment to confer privately. When they came back, they offered $300,000 but said that was their absolute limit. Guillermo said we wanted $350,000 plus documented changes to their security protocols, including dual verification for any DNA tests used in legal proceedings. The lawyers huddled again, and I could see them calculating how much a public trial would cost them in legal fees and reputation damage. They agreed to $350,000 and the security changes, and Guillermo said we'd need everything in writing with specific timelines for implementing the new protocols. I signed the settlement agreement a week later and deposited the check, bringing my total recovery to over $3 million from the inheritance, plus this additional compensation. The money felt heavy somehow, like it represented all the pain Candace had caused and could never truly make up for what she'd destroyed. 6 months passed after Candace's sentencing, and I still hadn't visited my grandfather's grave. Every time I thought about going, I felt this weight in my chest, knowing I'd have to face everything that happened around his death and his estate. But one Saturday morning in early fall, I woke up and knew it was time to stop avoiding him. I drove to the cemetery where he was buried next to my grandmother and walked through rows of headstones until I found his plot. Someone had left fresh flowers there recently, probably one of his old friends from the veterans organization he'd belonged to. I stood there looking at his name carved into the granite and felt tears start running down my face for the first time since the whole nightmare began. I told him about Candace and what she'd done, how she'd tried to steal everything he'd left me, and made it look like I wasn't even his family. I apologized for all the chaos and fighting over his estate, even though none of it was my fault. Standing there talking to a gravestone made me realize how heartbroken he would have been to know his own daughter did this to me. He'd loved Candace despite all her problems over the years, and kept hoping she'd change and become someone better. Now she was in prison, and I'd lost the aunt I thought I had, and my grandfather's legacy was tied to fraud and betrayal, instead of the good life he'd lived. I sat down on the grass next to his grave and made a decision right there. I wasn't going to let Candace's actions poison his memory or turn the inheritance into something ugly. My grandfather had worked hard his whole life and saved that money because he wanted to take care of his family after he was gone. I'd use it the way he would have wanted, to build something good and help people instead of just keeping it locked away like tainted money. The idea came to me over the next few weeks as I thought about what my grandfather valued most. He'd always believed in helping people who couldn't help themselves and standing up for what was right even when it was hard. I decided to establish a foundation in his name that would provide free DNA testing and legal support for families dealing with questioned paternity or inheritance fraud. Guillermo helped me set up the legal structure, and we filed all the paperwork to create a nonprofit organization. I reached out to Alexandria and asked if she'd serve on the board since she understood what families went through when DNA results were manipulated. She agreed immediately and said helping other people avoid what she'd suffered would give meaning to her nightmare. I contacted Sebastian next and proposed partnering with his investigation firm to help families who suspected medical fraud but couldn't afford private investigators. He said he'd been thinking about offering pro bono services for fraud cases, and this foundation would be the perfect way to structure that work. We spent 3 months planning everything from how families would apply for help to what kind of legal support we could provide. I put $500,000 from the inheritance into the foundation as seed money and set up monthly donations to keep it running. The foundation officially launched 4 months after I received the full inheritance, and we immediately got applications from families dealing with suspicious DNA results. Our first case involved a mother who'd been told her son wasn't biologically hers after a test at a different medical center, and Sebastian's team found evidence of similar tampering. Helping her get justice and prove her son was really hers felt like taking the evil thing Candace had done and transforming it into protection for vulnerable people. Hugo called me about a month after the foundation launched and said he'd been following our work. He asked if I'd be interested in collaborating on advocacy efforts to strengthen laws around medical fraud and DNA testing security. I met him for coffee, and he explained that he'd been contacted by a state legislator who wanted to introduce new regulations after reading about Candace's case in the news. The legislator was looking for victims willing to testify before a committee about their experiences and why stronger oversight was needed. I felt scared thinking about standing in front of government officials and describing what happened, but I knew it was important. Hugo and I worked with the legislator's staff to prepare testimony that covered both our cases and showed the pattern of how medical professionals could abuse their access to DNA testing systems. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks later at the state capitol. I drove there with Guillermo and met Hugo in the lobby of the legislative building. We walked into the committee room together and sat at a table facing a panel of legislators who looked interested but skeptical. When it was my turn to speak, I described how Candace had used her position at the medical center to steal my inheritance and tried to erase my connection to my grandfather. I explained the emotional damage of being told you're not related to the person who raised you and how easily she'd been able to manipulate the system. Hugo testified next about his experience with Candace's earlier fraud attempt and how the lack of security protocols enabled her to target multiple victims over years. The committee members asked questions about what specific changes would have prevented the fraud, and we explained the need for dual verification, audit trails, and oversight of employees accessing DNA results. Standing in that government building describing what Candace did was terrifying but also empowering somehow. 3 months later, the committee passed new regulations requiring independent verification for any DNA tests used in legal proceedings like inheritance disputes or custody cases. Knowing our nightmare had led to real systemic change made the whole ordeal feel less pointless. A year after the fraud was exposed, I was managing the foundation full-time, and we'd helped 12 families resolve inheritance and paternity disputes. 3 of those families had discovered fraud similar to what Candace did, with medical professionals tampering with results for personal gain. Our investigators worked with prosecutors to expose the people responsible and get them charged with crimes before they could hurt more families. I hired 2 staff members to handle the growing number of applications and set up partnerships with law schools to provide free legal representation. The foundation was using about $200,000 a year from the inheritance money, but we'd also started getting donations from people who'd read about our work. I still had hard days where I felt the weight of family betrayal and wondered if I'd ever fully trust anyone again. Sometimes I'd wake up angry at Candace for destroying something I'd never get back, that innocent belief that family meant loyalty and protection. But then I'd go to the foundation office and see families getting help, kids being reunited with parents they'd been separated from by false DNA results, and I'd feel like I was building something meaningful from the wreckage. The work gave me purpose beyond just surviving what happened. The letter from Candace arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a plain white envelope with the prison return address. I opened it standing in my kitchen and read her handwritten words about finding religion in prison and wanting to make amends for what she'd done. She wrote about attending chapel services and talking to a counselor who helped her understand how greed had corrupted her values. She said she was sorry for hurting me and asked if I could find it in my heart to forgive her so she could move forward on her spiritual journey. I read the whole thing once, felt absolutely nothing, and threw it in the trash. Guillermo called me that evening about something else, and I mentioned the letter. He said Candace had been writing similar letters to all her victims over the past month, probably trying to look rehabilitated for her eventual parole hearing. He'd gotten one himself even though he was just my lawyer, and Alexandria had received one that was almost identical to mine. I felt glad I'd trusted my instinct to throw it away because I didn't owe Candace forgiveness or closure. She deliberately tried to destroy my life for money, and the fact that she got caught didn't earn her my absolution. If she wanted to feel better about what she'd done, that was her problem to work through, not mine. 2 years after my grandfather's death, I was in a genuinely good place running the foundation and using my experience to help families navigate the same nightmare I survived. The inheritance that Candace tried to steal was funding real protection for vulnerable people, and we'd expanded to help families in 3 neighboring states. I'd connected with an amazing community of fraud survivors and advocates who understood what it meant to have your identity questioned and your family relationships weaponized. The foundation had helped 38 families by that point, and we'd contributed to getting 6 people charged with medical fraud in different jurisdictions. I'd never get back the aunt I thought I had, or the innocent trust I'd had in family before all this happened. Sometimes I still felt angry that Candace had taken something from me that couldn't be restored no matter how much justice I got. But I'd built something powerful from that loss, and I was proud of who I'd become through fighting for justice. My grandfather would have been proud too, I thought, knowing his money was protecting people instead of just sitting in a bank account. That felt like the best way to honor his memory and prove that Candace hadn't won, even though she'd tried so hard to destroy everything he'd left behind.